we know this chemical causes cancer. We've had a century of this chemical causing, trichloroethylene causing cancer, a century of this chemical causing cancer. Why can't we as a society, as a world, have clean water, clean food, and clean air? It'd be great for our generation, you, me, your listeners, to say we're going to be the last generation affected by Parkinson's disease.
Dr. Ray Dorsey is a professor in neurology and world-leading expert in Parkinson's disease. Dr. Ray, it's a huge honor to have you with us today, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation. And could you talk to us a little bit about the work and research that led you to believe that Parkinson's disease is a preventable disease?
Yeah, so the first major description, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your service to the Middle East community and beyond. So Parkinson's disease, the first major description was Parkinson's disease was in 1817, and when Dr. James Parkinson, a British surgeon, 61, described 6 people he sees on the streets of London with Parkinson's disease. Some of them he didn't examine, just simply observed them walking around. And then so he described, and he said this disease has been classified in the medical literature, suggesting that it was rare. Indeed, he just writes about 6 people. 200 years later, the global burden of disease studies estimates that 6 million people have the disease. And then last year, the global burden of disease estimated that nearly 12 million people have the disease. So how do you go from something that's not been classified in the medical literature affecting 6 people in London in 1817 to one of the world's fastest growing brain disease in 200 years? Well, aging can be part of it, but when we haven't aged that much, it's insufficient to explain it. Genes don't change, generally speaking, over that short period of time. So it needs to be what does change, and that's our environment. And so numerous research studies, both done in the laboratory and with humans, epidemiological studies, have linked certain pesticides, many of which are neurotoxins, to Parkinson's disease, linked a dry cleaning chemical called trichloroethylene, or TCE, to the disease, and then increasingly air pollution, a major factor in the Middle East, to the disease. So if you just look at the evidence, you look at the historical context, and you look at, twin studies, for example, suggest that the rates of Parkinson's disease are relatively similar among identical twins and fraternal twins, suggesting that the genetic component of the disease is modest, which many studies have since confirmed. You come to the conclusion that this is a man-made disease. It's principally due to chemicals in our food, water, and air, and thus eminently preventable.
You talk about the 2 chemicals, trichloroethylene and or TCE, or Perchloroethylene or PCE. Could you talk to us about those 2 chemicals, where they are found?
Yeah, so most of your listeners know that water is H2O. H2O is made up of 3 atoms. Trichloroethylene is made up of whopping 6 atoms. So it's got 2 carbons in black, 1 hydrogen atom in white, and then 3 chlorine atoms in blue, hence its name, trichloroethylene. It's got a cousin that's got 1 additional chlorine atom, and it's called either tetra, 4, or perchloroethylene. That chemical is widely used in dry cleaning. Today, I think I saw one report suggesting 60 to 70% of dry cleaners in the United States still use that chemical. TCE was found in everything from typewriter correction fluid, for your listeners who are young enough to remember typewriters. It was used to decaffeinate coffee in the United States. It was used as an anesthetic agent for pregnant women. It was used to degrease metal. If you or your uncle, ever sprayed something on an engine and the grease melted away, that was likely or possibly trichloroethylene. So TCE is known to cause cancer. That's the judgment of the World Health Organization, the Department of Health and Human Services in the U.S., and our Environmental Protection Agency. Perchloroethylene likely causes cancer. And these chemicals are associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's. They damage the energy-producing parts of nerve cells called the mitochondria, which we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. A study in the U.S. looked at Marines, military members, service members who served at a base that had their drinking water contaminated with this chemical, and found them to have a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's 35 years later compared to service members who served at a less polluted base in Los Angeles. And this chemical gets into the groundwater, it's estimated at one point up to 30% of groundwater in the United States was contaminated with it. So people could be drinking it. Or this chemical like radon evaporates from underlying contaminated water and soil and can enter people's homes, schools, or workplaces. And people could breathe it in for years and never know about it. Because of its widespread use, because of the studies done in humans and in the lab, I get concerned that this might be a major cause, not the major cause of Parkinson's disease in the United States. It's also used around the world. Unfortunately, use of the chemical is increasing globally, and about half the market for the chemical, according to industry reports, is now in China.
Is it labeled? Do you find it in washing material, dishwasher,
So
cleaning
it used to
equipment?
be used in a lot of household products. I think those uses have been banned in the United States. I don't know what the status is in other countries. I know Europe has largely gotten rid of it, but I just don't know how commonly it's still used in the Middle East. The main thing is like degreasing. So be careful if you got those chemicals, keep them outside of your house, away from your kids, and don't inhale
Pesticide. I know that Paraquat was also linked to Parkinson's disease
them.
and
Yeah,
other.
so the chemicals that have the most evidence for their link to Parkinson's are pesticides. And some of them, like Paraquat, is a weed killer. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's sprayed on fields for corn, soybeans, cotton, and vineyards, grapes, for making wine. It's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Researchers around the world have demonstrated in the lab that it produces the pathological and some of the clinical features of Parkinson's disease. And according to reporting from the British investigative journal The Guardian, the chemical company, one of the chemical companies manufacturing it, had exposed mice, rabbits, and rats to paraquat and demonstrated that they developed features of Parkinson's, including a tremor. And they did those experiments in the 1960s, 30 years before academic investigators reached the same conclusion.
I know that the Paraquat is used in farm, but is it used also in buildings, like for insects, and also the insect killing sprays are also contains pesticides that are linked with Parkinson?
Yeah, so it sounds like you read, I don't know, maybe we sent you an advanced copy of our book called The Parkinson's Plan,
Yes.
which is coming out in August in English. And we're hoping to get, we have a Spanish translation in process and working on others. We'd love to do one in Arabic. So if people have an idea, they can just email me at info@pdplan.org. If you have a publisher in the Middle East,
We'll link that.
info@pdplan.
We will link it. And can you pre-order this book?
You can pre-order the book right
Very
now, and Michael Oken, and I, who wrote the book, are devoting the vast majority of our proceeds to efforts to prevent and treat the disease.
Yes, thank you.
So there are pesticides. My colleague, Dr. Brittany Krzyzanowski at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, demonstrated that simply living living within 1 mile of a golf course associated with a doubling of your risk of Parkinson's disease, likely due to pesticide exposure. A pesticide widely found on apples called chlorpyrifos is also used on golf courses, utility poles, and wide range of applications linked to Parkinson's disease. Some of the flea collars that people use, or pesticides that they use inside their home, have been associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. So in our book, we give you 25 ways to lower your risk of ever getting Parkinson's, and 25 ways, if you already have the disease, to possibly slow its progression. And one of them is not to kill yourself by, or exposing yourself to pesticides in your home or on your lawn, pesticides are widely sprayed on schools and school playgrounds in the United States. I think we can resolve as a community globally to stop spraying pesticides on kids' playgrounds and schools.
And the effect of these sprayed materials, if there is a wind, it will start to blow it, I believe, and then you can inhale it. That's one of the
So it's
ways.
so the risks like smoking, it's not just the smoker who's at danger for getting lung cancer, it's people who are near the smoker. So secondhand smoke increases your risk of getting lung cancer. It turns out that secondhand exposure to pesticides increases your risk of Parkinson's disease. My colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles showed that simply living or working near where paraquat is sprayed, so you're not the farmer, but you live or work near where it's sprayed, is associated with a doubling of your risk of Parkinson's disease. I think you're getting the general theme that there's a large associated risk for exposure to these chemicals just in your environment, and you may not even know that it's being sprayed or what's being sprayed near your house or on your kids' playground or on the golf course down the road. Pesticides that get into well water, so I don't know what portion of people in the Middle East get their water from a well, as opposed to like city or municipal water. In the United States, city or municipal water is regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act since 1973 or thereabouts. But many people, 1 in 8 Americans, get their water from a private well on their property. And some of these wells are shallow, some are in agricultural areas, and some are prone to getting contaminated with pesticides that are sprayed on nearby farms, for example, or nearby golf courses. And people can be drinking pesticides in their water for years, and then decades later be developing Parkinson's disease.
Yes, and not just drinking, also, I believe that showering and using the water to clean the plates and so on, that can also contribute, or mainly through the gut?
That I have not seen. I'm happy to be educated. I haven't seen that. It's worth noting that this chemical, trichloroethylene, when it was at the Marine base in the water at the Marine base, so Marine base is like, think about a big college campus, think about like AUB or something like that. It's not just, it's not a small number of people. It's estimated that 1 million people between 1953 and 1986 were exposed to the chemical. And this chemical is readily volatile, so it readily evaporates. So that's why it can come up from the ground. And when you're taking a hot shower, for example, if you're taking a shower with water contaminated with this evaporates, and you can end up breathing it
Inhaling it,
in addition to drinking it or having a skin exposure.
Yes, and you talked about air pollution as well. Can air purifier help in getting rid of these particles, and also can air purifier help in getting rid of these chemicals?
Yeah, so likely the answer is yes, and that's the good news. It's one of our 25 recommendations to reduce your risk of Parkinson's disease. When you see air pollution, when you see smog in Dubai, or you see it in Los Angeles, you're seeing little pieces of dirt and soot that are suspended in the air, and the scientists call that particulate matter. Most of them we cough out or sneeze out. Some are so small, 1/30th of the width of our hair, are small enough to penetrate the nerve responsible for smell. And they're like a Trojan horse, and rather than carrying in military troops, they're carrying in toxic metals, lead from gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And these metals are associated with protein misfolding that's implicated in Parkinson's and in Alzheimer's disease. So air pollution is increasing number of studies are linking Parkinson's to air pollution. And I think air pollution is just a huge contributor to Alzheimer's disease. So if you live in a polluted area, I would definitely get an air purifier. It's very good at getting rid of some of this particulate matter. It might also be good at getting rid of some of the volatile organic chemicals like TCE in the air, and it might be good at getting rid of pesticides.
Okay.
Add one other thing. Same thing for water filter. So if you're uncertain of your water quality, or you just want to be safe, like I want to be, you can have a water filter just added to your water faucet, like in your kitchen, for example, and reduce your exposure to chemicals that are in your water. So there are lots of things that individuals can do to protect themselves, but fundamentally our health is a reflection of our previous environments. And those environments are largely dictated by decisions that we make as communities and societies. So we should choose wisely.
Yes, and buying organic also can help. And you talked about there is a special soap that you use to clean the vegetables.
So our book comes out in August, and on the back is the Parkinson's 25, and the #1 recommendation is to wash all your produce, even your organic ones. And so you can wash it with water, and that removes things that dissolve in water. But just like you bathe in the shower, you don't just use water, you use water and soap, because some oils and things don't wash out with water, they wash out with soap or fat. And so I use a vegetable wash. Essentially, it's soap, it's oils that you can just add to your big bowl. I have a glass bowl and I put my fruits in there, like berries last night, and I wash it with a little thing. It's like $4 for a bottle that lasts 6 months. And I use it to wash my fruits and vegetables, apples, for example. So I reduce my exposure, hopefully, to pesticides. Other studies have suggested that you can use salt or vinegar. So there's lots of options, inexpensive ways to reduce your exposure to pesticides in the food that you eat.
And those are special kind of soaps for vegetable because the other soap maybe will have other chemicals
Yeah,
or
so you just want less chemicals. So the vegetable wash, I think it has like coconut oil in it or something like that. So it's not terribly complicated and not terribly expensive.
I see.
But if you don't have that, other studies have suggested that vinegar and salt
Salt, yeah.
can help.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you about contact sport, such as martial arts and football. And if someone gets trauma to the head for a limited period and then they stop, can later in life, they would be higher risk for Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, so you're talking to a neurologist, and newsflash, neurologists don't like head trauma.
Mm.
And newsflash, head trauma predisposes you to getting neurological conditions that you don't want, whether that's Parkinson's disease or ALS or dementia. So protect your head. If you like to bicycle like I do, or ski or skate, wear a helmet. If you're in a car, use a seatbelt. It saves lives. And studies have shown that even one significant head trauma increase is associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's. And other studies have suggested that there's an interaction between exposure to chemicals like certain pesticides, and exposure to head trauma. So the combination of the two is more than adding the risk. It amplifies, it multiplies the risk. So protect your head. I also don't think it's like smoking. Just because you smoked in your 20s doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get lung cancer. That risk might be modifiable. And we know, for example, after you stop smoking, within 10 years, your risk of getting lung cancer is halved. And so I say, if you have had an early exposure to head trauma, or you've had an early exposure to pesticides, or you drank well water and you grew up, be especially vigilant about exposure to chemicals and toxins and head trauma now. Because it's likely, we don't know, but it's quite possible that reducing your exposure to other toxins now might reduce your risk of developing Parkinson's or other brain diseases in the future. It's not a fait accompli, I don't think, that you got exposed to head trauma or pesticides when you're young, that you're necessarily going to develop the disease. Modify that risk and reduce it. And we give you 25 ways to do that in the book. Parkinson's 25.
There are some research that's linking Alzheimer's disease to Parkinson's disease. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so lots of people, unfortunately, having one of the diseases does not make you immune to the other. And lots of people with Parkinson's disease have co-pathology. When you look at their brains under the microscope, not only do they have the pathology associated with Parkinson's, they have the pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease. I get really, really, really concerned about air pollution. I think we might be asleep at the wheel on the effects of air pollution. It turns out, according to the Global Burden of Disease studies, air pollution is more disabling than high blood pressure, more disabling than high blood glucose. And I think this is like really, really addressable. We mentioned air purifiers, rolling up your car, rolling up the windows when you're in traffic, recirculating the air, planting trees near schools that are located near highways, setting residential communities more than 500 meters away from busy streets. I mean, there are hundreds of things that we can do to reduce our exposure to air pollution. Anyone who's been to Los Angeles in the 1970s versus now, it's dramatically different. It's 50 to 90% better air quality. I think in the Middle East, I get really, really, really concerned about what we're doing in the Middle East. China has the fastest improving air quality in the world, according to some reports. This is very tractable. We improve our emissions standards. We can reduce our exposure to chemicals in the air. It's worth noting that many of these chemicals are inhaled. And when you inhale a chemical, you bypass the normal protective blood-brain barrier that keeps chemicals out of the brain. And so I think our nose might be the front door to our brain, and we're inhaling chemicals that are exposing a weakness in the normal protective mechanisms that the brain has. We know one of the earliest features of Parkinson's disease and one of the earliest features of Alzheimer's disease is loss of smell. And in many cases, that loss of smell precedes the diagnosis and symptoms of the disease by years, if not decades. We also know that the pathology of the disease in many individuals, one of the first places you find the pathology of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease is in the smell center or the olfactory bulb. So I think we have clues from pathology, we have clues from clinical signs, and we have clues from mechanism that the nose might be the front door of the brain, and that the chemicals in our environment that we're inhaling, whether that's particulate matter from cars, or pesticides from golf courses and farms, or chemicals like this from industrial sources, could be contributing to a wide range of brain diseases.
And can mask help in, if you put air purifier at home, that will help at home. When you go outside, can wearing mask help in?
Yeah. So we had, in the US, we had the Canadian wildfires, which have periodically contaminated the air over New York and the Northeast. And one day it was so bad in Rochester, New York, where I used to live, I like to bicycle, as I mentioned earlier, and I wore a mask, not because of any concern about COVID, but because I wanted to reduce my exposure to air pollution. So if you are fortunate to live in an area with high amounts of air pollution, wearing a mask can be helpful, especially for cognitive impairment. They've shown in California, I believe, women in their 70s with normal cognition, women who lived in highly polluted areas, I think it was Los Angeles, had an increased rate of cognitive decline compared to people who live in areas breathing clean air. So if you want to live a short, unhealthy life, breathe polluted air. And if you live in those areas, I think there are lots of things that you can do individually to reduce your exposure to it. But more fundamentally, we need to make better decisions in our communities and our societies to reduce our exposure to air pollution. I'll just say one more thing. This is not just for adults. Dr. Lilian Calderon Garcia-Duenas, an outstanding scientist and physician, was concerned about the effects of air pollution in Mexico City in the 90s, when Mexico City had the worst air pollution in the world. So it was the Delhi, India, or the Beijing, China of today. And she looked at the brains of children and young adults who unfortunately died prematurely from car accidents or gun violence in Mexico City. And she found the misfolding of the proteins implicated in Alzheimer's disease in 202 of 203 brains that she examined, including in children as young as 11 months old.
Are there any other chemicals that are linked to Parkinson, or any chemicals that you look for?
So the big three I look at are, and I'm biased by living in the United States, so I know best what I see, are certain pesticides, these dry cleaning and degreasing chemicals, trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, and air pollution. But unfortunately, they're not the only chemicals. There are chemicals widely used in the electronics industry called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, that were widely used and are likely linked to the disease. Heavy metals, as we mentioned earlier, are linked to the disease. There's been a study looking at microplastics. The health we enjoy is a reflection of the environment that we create. And if we want to live long, healthy lives, create healthy environments, why can't we as a society, as a world, have clean water, clean food, and clean air? We have those: clean food, clean water, and clean air, where we can live long, healthy lives, spend less money on healthcare, and enjoy the fruits and the gifts of a life.
Talked about the nasal exposure, and there is also the gut exposure.
In 2019, a really smart physician and scientist in Denmark named Dr. Per Borkhammer, with his colleagues, postulated that Parkinson's disease, that there's two forms of Parkinson's and other Lewy body disorders. One that is brain first, that begins in the nose and then spreads backwards to the part of the brain that causes tremor and slowness of movement. And there's a body first form of the disease that begins in the gut and then ascends and makes its way to the parts of the brain that are responsible for the slowed movement. Many of your listeners might know there's a nerve, it's like a highway that goes all the way from the lower part of our brainstem all the way to the gut, and that's called the vagus nerve. And it's possible that the misfolding of the proteins implicated in Parkinson's begins in the gut and then spreads along this highway, this nerve called the vagus nerve, all the way up to the lower part of the brain, and then from there spreads upwards. So it's quite possible that chemicals that we ingest, toxins that we ingest, could lead to a body first or gut first form of Parkinson's disease or dementia with Lewy bodies. For example, some of those pesticides could be in food we eat, for example, ultra-processed foods often have high levels of pesticides, or can be in the water we drink. And so that's another way that this could start.
Okay, and this is a bit of a philosophical question, but can behavior or chemical addiction kill dopamine receptor, and that contributes to Parkinson's disease?
Well, I'll say, to my knowledge, there aren't really good studies linking substance abuse. Generally speaking, there's one anecdotal story, substance abuse to Parkinson's disease. Now, there's lots of other reasons, lots of other problems associated with substance abuse, but it's not, to my knowledge, been a huge factor and risk factor for Parkinson's disease.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the treatment and whether levodopa is a symptomatic treatment or it does stop the progression of the disease?
So the good news is Parkinson's disease is, the great news is Parkinson's disease is preventable. The good news is that Parkinson's disease is treatable. And the first treatment I recommend is exercise. So it turns out exercise, vigorous exercise, not only reduces your risk of ever getting Parkinson's disease, but increasing number of studies suggests it can be quite beneficial for slowing the rate of progression or reducing the disability associated with the disease. So I routinely recommend that people with Parkinson's disease exercise at least an hour a day. And I say if I had the disease, I would do 2 hours a day. Obviously, if you can are able to do that. So if you have Parkinson's disease and you can walk or swim or bike or do yoga or non-contact biking or dance, do those things because it could be beneficial in terms of slowing the rate of progression of the disease.
Any specific exercise, cardio or strengthening or isometric or mobility or?
So usually enough to make vigorous exercise, cardiovascular, that can increase your heart rate and make you sweat a little bit. And exercise releases growth factors in the brain that might be beneficial in terms of protecting the remaining nerve cells that have been damaged as part of Parkinson's. And then, as you suggested, Parkinson's is loss of nerve cells that produce a chemical called dopamine. So in the 1960s, researchers made this observation that the brains of individuals with Parkinson's had lower levels of dopamine in it than brains without. And they said, well, why don't we just try to replace that and give people dopamine? Well, the dopamine didn't work. It made people vomit and it wasn't effective. So they created a precursor to dopamine called levodopa, which, given with another medication to help control the nausea, is a highly effective medicine for Parkinson's disease. And it reduces the symptoms of the disease. It makes you have less tremor, less slowness of movement, can walk better. It might even be good at treating the depression and the anxiety that's part of Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, despite the medicine being 60 years old, being very generally safe, inexpensive, it's not universally available. One of the things we call for in the book is to make levodopa widely available. Turns out the UN AIDS is working to make highly active antiretroviral therapy medications for HIV available to at least 90% of people who have the disease. If we can make more expensive, less safe, more complex medications for HIV available to 90% of the world's population, we should be able to make a safe, inexpensive one like levodopa available to 100%. Synthetic dopamines are associated with, more than levodopa, are associated with compulsive gambling, sexual behavior, eating, and shopping. So I personally tend to avoid them. I recommend people exercise as much as they can to the extent possible, feasible. And then a little bit of levodopa can help lots and lots of people.
Are there any upcoming research or treatment that there will be something curable for Parkinson?
I think the prerequisite to curing a disease is to find out its cause. And once you find out its cause, then you can cure the disease or more effectively develop treatments. Everything from HIV to stomach ulcers. Once we figured out what the cause was, it was much, much, much easier to figure out what were highly effective treatments. And if we put a little bit more time and energy, out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing the disease. If we find out which of these chemicals, as you were alluding to, are causing the disease, we can more effectively find better treatments faster and even the elusive cure. But just remember, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the best thing is to never get the diseases. I mean, we live in a world where polio is increasingly rare, if not, and can be disappearing. HIV is disappearing with a condom. You know, what can we do to prevent people from getting Parkinson's disease? Can we spray 50% less pesticides on golf courses? Can we stop spraying pesticides on kids' schools and playgrounds? Can we, rather than subsidize the production of conventional or pesticide-laced agricultural products, if we're going to subsidize crops, why don't we subsidize organic ones? I think there are lots and lots of things that we can do to reduce our risk of ever getting Parkinson's disease, so the need for a cure just disappears.
Are there any studies that suggest someone with Parkinson who change the environment or try to avoid these toxins will reverse the disease to some extent, or at least slow the progression to that he wouldn't get worse, basically?
Yeah, so there are studies that link increased amounts of air pollution with hospitalization for Parkinson's disease. So air pollution could be exacerbating the effects of Parkinson's disease. This might also be true for Alzheimer's disease. The analogy I like to use is, if a smoker comes into the doctor and is diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the physician's going to recommend?
Stop smoking.
Stop smoking. But if a farmer comes in with Parkinson's disease, shouldn't we tell them, are you being exposed to pesticides in the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the work you do? And I think there are lots and lots of things that we might be a little bit asleep on, a little bit late on, in terms of trying to find out ways that very easy ways to slow the rate of progression of the disease. Now, those studies haven't been done. Again, we're not spending our money wisely, I don't think, and we're not spending enough, but we're not spending it wisely. Because if you can slow your rate of progression of disease by stop getting exposed to air pollution, stop getting exposed to pesticides, stop getting exposed to industrial chemicals, shouldn't that be among the first recommendations that we should be providing to people affected by the disease? So lots of people work with the chemicals that are linked to Parkinson's disease. We mentioned the risk of farmers who work with Paraquat or a pesticide called rotenone, 150% increased risk. TCE is estimated that 10 million Americans worked with this chemical in the 1970s. Estimated 1 in 12 workers in the United Kingdom worked with the chemical. Printers, painters, mechanics, embalmers, varnish workers, textile manufacturers, all as semiconductors, electronics, all had potential to be exposed to TCE. So we need to find safer chemicals. This chemical was first developed in the 1860s and was first commercially used in the 1920s. So we know this chemical is a carcinogen, it causes cancer. We've had a century of this chemical trichloroethylene causing cancer, a century of this chemical causing cancer. You know, we have great chemists in the United States and in the Middle East and around the world who can certainly come up with safer degreasing agents. And some chemical companies even advertise or promote safer alternatives to trichloroethylene. It's time for us to use safer alternatives to it. The analogy I like to use is, you know, engineers have developed safer cars and safer airplanes. No one would drive a car or few of us would drive in a car from the 1960s, and none of us from the 1920s, and none of us would fly in an airplane from the 1920s. If engineers over 100 years can create safer cars and safer airplanes, chemists can come up with safer degreasing chemical and safer pesticides.
Well, Dr. Ray, this has been incredible. Thank you very much for all of this valuable information. And would you like to add anything? You told us that a new book is coming for you. What can people expect in the new book? Can you tell us a little bit about it, and where can they order it as well?
Sure. So the book called The Parkinson's Plan comes out in August in English. You can order it on Amazon or any of your favorite booksellers right now. You can learn more about the book at www.pdplan.org, pdplan.org. If you have a story that you want to share or a question, you can just email us at info@pdplan.org. You know, the medical textbooks are filled of diseases that no longer are plagues to us: smallpox, bubonic plague, yellow fever, polio. Wouldn't it be great for our generation, you, me, your listeners, to say we're going to be the last generation affected by Parkinson's disease? Can we make it that future generations don't get Parkinson's disease, that by 2035, the global incidence of Parkinson's disease is 0%, and that in 2036, the fall of Parkinson's disease begins? I think it's a challenge to our generation, a challenge to physicians like you and me, and a challenge that we should take up and to give the gift to future generations of a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common.
Well, that's the hope, and hopefully all of the work you do, I'm sure, will lead to, with leading physician like yourself, will get rid of Parkinson, or at least make it extremely rare.
Yeah, and these diseases, they don't disappear because of physicians. They disappear because people make their voices heard, whether that's the HIV community, whether that's the people at risk for polio, whether that's Mothers Against Drunk Driving. When people make their voices heard, we can get rid of pesticides in schools, we can get reduced pesticide use on golf courses, we can clean our air. These are all things that we've done in the past. We've gotten rid of DDT. We can do the same thing for these pesticides and chemicals today.
Okay, well, it's been an honor, and thank you very much, Dr. Ray.
Thank you. Best wishes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All the best.